All righty, so let's kick it off. I'm going to share my screen. I went a little bit different of a route here. We're not going to go into PowerPoint at all. But again, at any point, feel free to ask me any questions. I have the Q&A area up and the chat up too. You'll get the most out of this if you do ask questions. What we'll be talking about today is going through and streamlining our Revit templates and standards. This is something I'm very passionate about, and this is something we do have here at ATG. If you are ever wondering about your template and the validity of that template and have some questions about how to increase efficiency and just your overall template health, there's two different things that you can go through and do. You can do a Revit model health check. That's typically what we do on models itself, but we also run them on templates too. That is free. And it is complimentary. I would actually restate that, not free, it's complimentary, because typically it does run around a couple of hours to do that. So at cost of what someone's doing it, we do it complimentary. There is a website link to that here. Let me just bring this up, this link. You can also find it on our website page, and I'll put this in the chat for everybody. If you do go to atgusa.com, I think I have it up on this one. I'll just drag it over. I'll just go to the home page. So if you go to the home page, you go to services, architecture, and structural services. And if you're not part of those two disciplines, that's okay. Let me see if it's under MEP as well. It's not. That's fine. But if you go to architecture and structural services, you will find it right here. So if you do lose the link, no worries. We can go through and run a complimentary model health check. You just click the link and can read through this and see what this means and what they are. Basically, what we'll be doing today is the after part of it. This is going to go through and check the validity of that model health and the template health, and then we can go through and run some other things after as we address some of those things, which we'll talk about some things that we go through here. Another thing we do here at ATG is we do template reviews, which is typically around a 15 to 20 page report giving you things of advice and things that we can go through and do to help your health of your template and things and standards that we've learned along the way and what industry standards are doing too. Again, it's around a 15 to 20 page report. We do an action item after, things that you can go through and do yourself, or if you don't have the time, we'd be more than happy to help you out with that as well. But today, what we're going to go through and talk about specifically in this webinar is the after part, things that we can go through and do ourselves within our template to streamline those standards and create a more efficient process, right? And I'll go through and talk about a lot of the points that I look at when I go through and do a template review. I, of course, didn't bring open a template that is an old template that I used. It's more of a project that I brought into as a template just to give us some advice on things that are poorly done and things that can create more of a stagnant environment, right? Templates are living, breathing documents. They should be ever changing, and you should be always checking the validity of them because they're the starting point of our projects, right? If you're not starting off with a nice, clean slate, then you're going to run into issues that compound down the road when you're using your design environment. So we're going to go through and just run some checks, right? A typical check that I go through and just, it's kind of in our nature, and this is for all disciplines, but it comes a lot with the structural design environment. So let me introduce myself. My name is Mike Lechave. Totally skipped that part. I am the structural services manager here at ATG and the interim consulting manager for architecture. So hopefully, if you do have questions about either of those, you can ask me. All you MEP folks, don't worry. You can still run through the same process. Civil, you're kind of out of the bag on this one just because there's not so much workflow involved with Revit itself. But if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us after this. We'd be more than happy to help you out. Again, use the chat area, the Q&A, if you do have questions along the way. But typically, when I start a template review and looking to streamline some processes, there's a lot of issues with some folks that have standards in templates that are old. They haven't even gone through and checked old standards that they've had in place and things that have gone wrong in that template. A lot of that transition has happened when we came from AutoCAD to Revit, and maybe we brought in some unnecessary content that we didn't even know was part of our projects that comes starting out with our template. So typically what I'll go through and do is after I run a model health check, I get all of the data. There's an Excel sheet that comes with it as well that allows me to go through and really dig deep into our families and our content within them into file size. Typically a template file you want around, I would say 10 to 15 megs, nothing over that. If you have something over that, there's some issues with what content you're providing within your templates. And we can always, again, after action items, talk about that as well. But to start out with, typically I use one of our CTC tools here. So if you look over here, you have a tab called CTC software. You can go and download a 14-day free trial and get full access to all of these tools. If you have these tools already, we're just going to run through some of the ones that I would use when doing a template review and streamlining those standards to create a more efficient process, right? When you're starting out, you want to have an efficient process. You want to make sure that that model's lean and you're not going through and wasting time trying to add content in there that is always going to be used. Or maybe just having a large bloated template that you're starting out with that then kind of has that tendency to create a lag, right? I call it the spinning wheel of death. We're sitting here waiting for things to load. That's time wasted at someone's end, right? So typically what I go through and use is one of the tools from the CTC BIM Manager suite. So there are 3 different suites here. We'll use one tool from the batch suite. And this is if you don't have the ability to go through and run a model health check and get some more data from more of an Excel standpoint, but you want to see the file size of your families themselves. We're going to use one of the tools in here called Family Exporter. The other tools I'm going to be using are in the BIM Manager suite. I'm going to be using Type Swapper. And then I'm also going to be using Shared Parameter Manager. This is a great tool if we're going to go through and add parameters from 2 different shared parameter files to create a master file. That always happens, right? Folks create their own shared parameter folder. And then when we're trying to add these parameters back, they're different GUID values, which means that they're not going to work. They're not going to have the same data. They may have the same name, but they're not the same data, transferring that information to tags, to schedules, or any of that through the families, right? So this is one of the tools I use as well. But first, typically, I start out with Type Swapper. Full circle, structural industry. We have that migration from AutoCAD to Revit with a lot of typical details. And most of the time, we go through and just explode our CAD content and don't think anything of it and what that repercussion has in our project. So this was a project that I brought some of that into, exploded the content, made the worst one that I could to go through and see that. And kind of a cliff note there, sometimes we do think we've cleaned everything out. And when that happens, I typically go to line patterns and find the imported content. And that means we have something to address with all of those. But first, I start out with dimension styles. We'll talk about duplicate families here in a second. And that's because this was a project where I copied stairs from one file to the next, and it created a duplicate family. We've all been there. You have the number 1 value next to it. How do we get rid of that content? Because it's the same one, just as grids, right? We'll talk about that in a second, but first let's go to dimension styles. So with dimension styles, we can go through and look and see some of the differences that we have here for these different dimension styles and see if that's not part of our standard. This will also allow you to standardize what's already in your template that may not be the actual standard that we want to implement into our template. So from here under dimension styles, what we're able to go through and do is look at all of our dimension styles in our project. And then we have the option to go through and switch them out. So if you do not have a standard yet, I'd go through and create your standard dimension styles. Then from there, you'll be able to come into here. And what I usually do is go through and check. So this would be a question if I was interacting with one of you all and you wanted me to go through, we did a template review and you wanted me to go through and standardize all of these options. I would go through and ask, well, which dimension styles do you want to keep, right? So arrow 3/32 Arial versus this, other one that we have down here that's 1/8 of an inch, if that's something that I'm ever going to use. And maybe it's not, right? Maybe everything should be 3/32 versus 1/8 of an inch. And what this allows me to do is also see that it's in use. So if I don't want this one to be my template typical style that's in there, what I'm able to do is see it's in use in this project. It was a project before, not a template, so that's why it's in use. Typically, you would see 0 being used unless you're outlining some things in your template. But what I'm able to do is say, okay, I don't want this one in my template. I want to switch this over to my standard right? So we can go down and switch this to our standard that we want to have for our arrow. So if we're going to go through on a baseline, an arc length here. So we can go through and switch this out to be, we'll just say this is going to be the incline. All you have to do is hit swap. Very simple. It's going to swap those over, and then you'll have the 3 assigned to that specific value, and you can go through and delete the other one, right? Now that this is not being used, I can go through and delete this. And let's say we knew that this was an ongoing issue and we have projects that we want to clean out. Typically, I would just go through before you make the swap. If you swap it to something else, all you need to do is just save the selection, and it knows which one the original one was and where it's supposed to be swapped to. So you can go into an existing project if you know there's some issues with some of your dimension styles and have it automatically select and swap those out for you as well. Next is your text types. So if you go through and look at your text types here, you can go and see that there's a lot of text types that were brought in. I know this because I intentionally exploded a lot of the content that was text from the DWG file. They weren't cleaned out properly before they even brought in. Text still brought over. And now I have a lot of this text that was already brought in from our AutoCAD standards, which is what I don't want, right? And we can tell that they're in use. I know they're in use just because I did this, and they're in use in our drafting views here. And they're not supposed to be used or even be brought into here, because now I have all of these different individual GUID values as being associated to my content in my project, which is creating bloat essentially. So what I want to go through and do for this is I'm able to go through and select some of these instances and change them to what they are indifferent to our text types. Again, same process. Well, which text types do you want to keep that are not existing here, right? All of my existing ones here are 1/4, 1/8 of an inch is typically what I use for these. And maybe Arial 3/32 too. For our different size of text, right? So you would want to go through and notice, okay, well, this is 1/8 of an inch Swiss trans. Well, that's actually not what it's supposed to be. So the translucent text that we have, this is supposed to be 1/8 of an inch Arial text, but there's 110 instances being used in the project. I need to switch those out. So what you're able to go through and do is you can go through and just say, okay, I'm going to change these specific ones to 1/8 of an inch Arial. And you can go through and pick all of the ones that you want and hit swap. This is going to give you a report if something goes wrong. The only time I've seen where it didn't want to transition them was more of line patterns, because some of them are on top of one another in locations, and you'll have to go through and just do a select one, select all instances in project and switch those out. But that's different workflow if it didn't happen or didn't work. That's another option. But now we see that those were all brought over, and now I can go back to this one that now has 0 and delete this from here, because that's not part of our template. It should never have been used. And it was brought in specifically on this instance from me exploding content, but it could have been created by an end user, right? So just thinking of those different instances that you may encounter. End user maybe created something that's not supposed to be our template in our template and standardize. And you can also run this on an existing project to see if folks are going through and creating their own, which they shouldn't be, and address those in an actual project that's having an issue with standardization from folks adding things, right? But this instance, I'm saying this is my template. I brought it from a project. I liked a lot of things in it, and I want to remove content to make this more of our standard. So you can go through and do that. Again, this is for all of your text types. So if you wanted to go through and just look at all of them, I like to use the checks because those would be my approved. It does save with the cached local data. So if you're ever wondering if those get removed from the checks, they do not. When you check them, they stay in that metadata for it. And if you know this is an issue as you're starting out from your template, again, you can always save this selection out somewhere. And then when you're ready, you just can load this back in. It will automatically go through. So what that means is you need to intentionally say, I want this one to be this next one. Do not hit swap yet. Save your selection because you've selected the changes for them. And then when you're in your new project, you just hit load, and then you need to come and hit swap. One question may be, hey, Mike, can I do more than one? Yes, you can. So you can go through and do more than one. If you have a lot, though, a lot of instances on that specific text type, I would recommend doing some of them, not all of them at once. And I'm talking about 1,000. I've seen 4,000. do not do, 1,000 and a 4,001 at the same time. Just do one instance. Perfect. Do we have any questions or any comments on the dim styles or text styles as I go through and standardize my template? Great. Looks like I have some MCRs in here as well. Getting to see a little different side of me versus Bluebeam. Thanks, Ed, for joining. We do host this thing called the Morning Coffee Review, which isn't a webinar. It is a live podcast every single Tuesday at 8:30 CST. If you're looking for some free Bluebeam training from a BCI, I'm a Bluebeam certified instructor, as well as another BCI, Jason Artley. We host that every single Tuesday, 8:30 CST. Justin, if you're still in here and you have a second, can you drop a link to that and go through there? Can you delete a specific text without the CTC software? You can. It's just more time. So that's one of those things that just comes with the cost efficiency, your ROI, return on investment. If you want to do it in mass like this, great. If not, you have to go down to your families. The issue with that is you would have to find one instance, select all and change them, and then go through and delete it. Because if you delete it when there's an instance, it's going to delete the actual text itself. So hopefully that answers your question. Because you could, which would take a lot of time, right? But you could go through to your families and then, not sheets, go to annotation, and then you can go through and look at your text types that you have for it, switch it out. Well, you would want to go and find an instance. So I'd go to like a drafting view here that has some of these instances of these text values. Don't want to save. And I want this text. Well, you would say select all instances so that you can do it manually. So in the entire project, and then switch them to your new one, and then go through and delete that text out. Thanks, Justin. Should all of the unused be deleted? Yeah, well, not necessarily. So all unused may be part of your template. So if I go back to my text type and there's 0 being used and it's a template, they're probably not being used, right? What you're deleting is ones that you know are not part of your company standard. Yeah, you can get, I'm in Revit 2022. You can get CTC tools for all release versions of Revit. So I'll drop a link here after this as well, Manuel, on how you can go through and download some trials of them, unless Justin has another free second. And I would just say, I owe you, Justin. Thanks for the other link. But I can Google one right here after this to get access to the trials of them. Didn't mean to exit out of that one. So hopefully that answered your questions. Should all, yep, I answered that one. I was going to ask the same question. Yep, perfect. Okay. So the next one's line styles. Line styles. So there's a couple different things with line styles. If you didn't know, if you transfer over and explode AutoCAD content into Revit, you get unnecessary content that are the layer associations to your line styles in Revit. So if there's a layer created in AutoCAD, it comes in as a line style in Revit. Now, there's kind of two different ways you can go through and assess that transition of those AutoCAD details. I used to do it where I would have my line styles named and created for 5 different layer states in AutoCAD. That way, when I brought it over into a container file, you should never explode in a template. You should never explode in a project. You should explode in a copy of your template. That's a project that we would call a container file, because you're isolating all of that stuff. Now, that template file would have had 5 layers or line styles, which are what we call them in Revit, that are the same names of your layers in AutoCAD. So when you come in and you explode the content, that line layer from AutoCAD moves directly onto the same line style name that Revit has. Now, if you have a lot like this does, you would want to use one of these tools from the CTC suite, which would be the line style issues. And we can see here that these may not be what are part of our standards. And there's 8,622 SDIMs in my entire project from exploiting this content. And really, there's supposed to be a thin line from Revit line styles that we have already. So you can go through and transition those out of those layer states to those. I know for this one, we'll just use this one as an example here. We can go through and look at our thin lines are at 1,818. I want to switch these additional ones to that one, and I can hit swap. And then after that, what we can go through is delete those out once they've been changed out to them. It may have some issues again with those line stacking. We'll figure that out here in a second as it goes through and runs and switches those. So basically it's grabbing all those line styles and removing them directly from our project into the correct line style state that we have from our template file itself. So being aware of that and going through and being able to go through and run that as well. Again, some of the larger ones, I probably should have tested that before because I went through and just exploited way too much and how they were grouped together. But again, going through and being able to do this in a project is very helpful. You can also use another tool from the batch suite as well. And of course, this is going to happen when I'm in a demo. You can also go through and do this from the batch suite outside of your projects. So if you didn't want to be inside of the project and you wanted to run it on multiple projects, you can go through and do that with Project Processor. And of course, this is going to happen right now. It's going to be a couple seconds as this goes through, but I'll answer your question. Does this change line styles within fill patterns and masking regions? So there's actually a fill pattern dialog box here that gives you access to your fill patterns as well. Oh, thanks, Justin. What is the expense? I don't know the prices, but we could definitely get in contact with you after this to give you the price of cost of what these are as well. But I'll tell you, they're not significant. They get back your return on your investment amount of time, because there was a question about doing it manually. Trust me, I used to do manual all the time. I wish I had these tools when I was in the industry, because now that I'm on the consulting end, it's a lot easier for me to clean other folks' content out and go through and run that. But we'll reopen this. I'll switch another one over. Yeah, it's just like Tom said. So this is one of those issues, right? There was things that weren't joined. 122 were I'm going to unjoin those and it's going to swap. Perfect. And it did successfully. So I can go through and delete that content out as well. So that's just how the content was brought over from AutoCAD. I have another webinar that I did on how you should do it correctly, because there was those instances where lines weren't joined and they were joined and they had an issue with transferring them over. There's an easier way to do it to make sure that you don't have to have and run into these issues where it's having trouble. It's basically Revit having trouble to unjoin the content, switch them over to the new line style themselves, which happens sometimes. So I'm gonna delete that out. Perfect, done. Now those are line styles. Coming back to line patterns. Now, there's been times where I've done template reviews and come up with a bunch of scenarios in beneficial areas to be more efficient. And one of them is this. So folks, I will have asked, have you ever had issues and bloat with your content within your template file? And they'll say, no one's ever exploited content. And that would have been because they maybe went into their line styles and deleted them, which you can do manually. It takes time. Again, I'm going to show you both. Once you start doing this, you'll realize that it's going to be a lot easier when you are using the tools that I am showing you. This would be the way that you would go through. You would find one. I'd probably go and find one of these line styles, select all instances, and then you can grab that and change it to a different line style. And then come into here and delete this one. It's a manual process and it takes a long time. Or you could use a tool, one user interface, and select all and move them over. Next one would be your fill patterns. But again, you can go back into your CTC tool here, type swapper. I'm going to go back into my line patterns. And again, you'll see these import options. And those are all of your line patterns that you get from AutoCAD that have been just imported in here. There's not that many in this one, but there's still a lot that you can go through and remove these out, right? Again, account is notifying you how many are in the existing project so you can switch them over. Same thing though, as we said earlier, save selection, load selection if you're finding this is a tendency to have. Next is your fill pattern. So you have your drafting and model patterns here for the type. So you can go through and assess these. As you can see, a lot of these are from DWG content and they should not be being used in the project. Most of them are duplicates of the specific instance. This is a little bit more investigative because you don't know exactly, even though it created a new number for it, is that what is this one meant to be in your existing template, right? So just being aware of that, you're going to have to go through. If you don't know your template standards, sometimes it's harder if you don't know your AutoCAD standards of what these were, because when you're in here, you kind of have to question because you don't see the image of it. So you have to go and find one and say, okay, that's what it's supposed to be. Let me bring them over to there. So that's really why if you go and watch my video on bringing your AutoCAD details over into Revit, I don't even bring in my hatch patterns into here because it's such a investigative issue. You have to do a lot of forensics on it to figure out what is what. I just recreate my fill patterns once they've been brought in. For those folks that have a lot of materials and you want to assess your materials, you can go through and look. This is not that much on the structural end, but maybe architectural folks that are listening in, you can go through and assess all of your material values in here and change those out to a different material value and then delete them. So this is a great tool if you're trying to create your material values or material just in general in your project. You can easily go through and remove the content from here and switch those over to the existing ones that they should be. So if you ever have an issue with materials, same thing. Going back to our duplicate content, this happened because I copied over stairs. I copied monitored grids and levels. Grids and levels is something that's typically copied and monitored from the structural end to make sure they're aware of things being changed. I never really copy walls or floors over because that creates duplicate instances, which I don't want if we're doing coordination, let's say novice work, so I don't have to set up another statement so that it doesn't notice those as clashing. But I do copy over my grids and levels. That way I can be made aware of if those change, copy, monitor, not just copy. And when they copied over, it created that one instance. So I know they're the same family and I want to swap these out to what they should be. It automatically notices those same instances for you. So there's not much guesswork here. All you have to do is just say swap and delete those duplicate families. It's a little bit different than the other ones because this will automatically do it. And this will delete those. And if there's another family, it'll give you the option for those that you want it to be. So I can just hit swap and it will delete those duplicate families as well. This gives you a report. If something failed, it'll tell you why it failed as well. So now I have no more duplicate families in this project. Well, template file that I created into a project. You could still run this on a .rte, by the way. So if I open this up just as a template, I didn't want to fix my poorly made template because I wanted to be able to go through and run this again. So I mean the lines that make up the sketch, not the pattern itself. Yeah, so the lines that make up the sketch, are we talking about hatch patterns, I guess would be the question, Chris? If we're talking about just lines in general, right, that make up the sketch, that's your line style. Going over to the next thing. So next thing would be our shared parameter manager. I love using this tool. This tool has come in handy quite a few times because there'll be instances, because another thing we do here at ATG is we create custom content. So if you don't have the time to go through and create custom content or the expertise, either of those, a bunch more of other reasons too, we can go through and create custom content. And typically, if we don't receive a shared parameter file, we'll create our own. But then the question is, great, now I have two separate shared parameter files. how can I go through and merge those together? Because if we lose that GUID value, I can't recreate that same GUID value after the fact for a new family that's being created, right? This tool will allow you to go through and do that. Sorry for the cough and the sneezing. Caught a cold, powering through it though. So I apologize if you hear a cough or me sniffling a little bit. This first tab, so I open this tool up, go through to this first tab. You can browse to your shared parameter folders. So this is my master one. So the first one is your existing one that you're going to keep as the master shared parameter file. The next one is your source. So any other one that you find that you need to grab that specific parameter value from into here. This tool looks at the GUID value, not the name of it. So if you have an existing one with the same GUID value and you drag it over, because that's how you move these over to your master file, it will tell you, because I will do this right now. The one I did earlier, I don't remember which one, that said, hey, this one's already existing. Hopefully the same one happens in here. But let's talk first about this master file. It's always a long and strenuous process to go through and rename and modify these, as we've all experienced before. With this tool, you can go through and modify this in one UI. The great thing about this, though, too, which we all know if we open up a shared parameter file and try to manage it from the general UI of Revit, we can't go through and change its grouping, and we can't go through and change its discipline. We could I'll take that back. I don't remember if we can rename it or not, but we can go through and not change its parameter type either. With this option, we have all of that available for us in this one UI. We can rename it. We can go through and change its grouping, its discipline, parameter type, visible, modifiable. We can go through and change its category with another tool, which would be family processor. Just be aware if you're changing its category, it's going to remove most of the content behind it. So, there's kind of a if there. That's why it's really not permitted. We can move it too. So if we wanted to move it next to a different category, we have that option. If we wanted to duplicate it, we can. If we wanted to add groupings from here, we can. Main question would be, hey, Mike, I want to bring in from that source file that you created all of our parameters in so we can add it to our master file. So we have that same GUID value. So for those folks that don't know how parameters work, let me just give you a hierarchy of how parameters work. There's project parameters that are specific to the project, that will schedule, but not from a specific family. If it's embedded in a family, there are family parameters, which won't schedule and tag either because it's specific to the family. Then there are shared parameters. Revit uses, if we all know Revit, internet unstable, I should be back, sorry. Once this little icon goes away, internet back. Okay, cool. The 32-character code is kind of like, I don't know, barcode, essentially. It's how Revit uses its database to manage information. If it sees the same 32-character bit number somewhere, it's going to plug that same one as equal, and the value that's there is going to reflect. That's why you usually use shared parameters and families to tag and schedule information. And then there's global parameters. Global parameters will control a parameter that's in a project as well. So those are your parameters. If you ever have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. Be more than happy to give you an example and kind of show you how those work. But going back in here, if you want to grab the shared parameter that was from a source file using my example, excuse me again, I went and created parameters for your project, for your family, and you need them in your master in case you want to use the same parameter and you don't want to have to open up a different parameter file. All you have to do is just grab that one from the source. Grab one, drag it over and drop it into that category. Grouping. Now this will tell you the parameter was not copied because the parameter, so this exact parameter is being used in this one by its GUID value. So it's looking at the GUID value and saying, hey, does this master one already have the same one? If it does, it's not going to add it. So you don't have to worry about accidentally adding two different ones under two different groupings, because it's going to look for that good value. And if it's equal, then that means do not add it. Warning, it won't add it. That way you're aware of it. So that's how you can easily just go through, grab things from a source one and drag it into your master one. So now you have a single shared parameter file, not multiple shared parameter files. Super, super helpful. Now, if you're trying to go through and load shared parameters into it, you can do it one by one, which we all know takes a lot of time, a lot of fun, right? With this one, you can go through and do it in mass as you're going through and adding them from your shared parameter file. Again, I can just go through and browse to my file here. Now I have the option to grab which one I want to bring over and select the set over as many many of them as I want, and add some of the values. You're going to have to be, a little bit careful when you're adding in mass in terms of instance and type and what you're going to be selecting over. But once you go through, you can select the individual one, have it where it's able to be going through and add it, even highlights specific ones that are types versus instance. Instance ones can only be added to specific categories versus your types. So that's this tool. I guess let me restate this. This is a very helpful tool, not that I think it is, to go through and manage your shared parameter file within your template, right? We're trying to streamline this process, not have to go to 3 different shared parameter files, look for them, where are they at? You have your one master file, and this is how you get everything into that one master file itself. And with any of these CTC tools, you can always go back and look at your videos. So these are videos that CTC, I think it's just the CTC ones. You can always go to our YouTube channel as well, ATG USA, and look at all these as well. If you kind of don't retain most of the information here and you're getting the process down from listening to me, which is awesome. And then going through to here to reiterate some of those processes within the tool itself. And Justin, thank you for posting the link. So the link's in the chat to get access to the tools for a trial. If you're interested in purchasing them as well, by all means, just reach out to us. We can talk to you about that even more too. So I'll close out of this. The other thing would be if you're not using some type of tool to export out data. I'm big on data forensics and looking at information to see what issues are because the data is true. What you can do is use Family Exporter. So if you don't have something that's going to export out information in some type of an Excel sheet, so you can look at file size for some of your families. Typically, I don't want to see a family over, let me try to remember what I usually look at. I would probably say over 1,000 kilobytes, so 1 meg. If I see a family over that, I would want to go in and address and see why it's such a larger family. But if you don't have those, you can use one of these tools. This is actually a free tool. So after you download the 14-day free trial, which you get access to all tools, you'll see here the darker color icons are paid for tools. The lighter color icons are free tools. This is actually a free tool. This can be used for multiple of cases. This instance I'm using it for is to export my families that are in this project to see the file size of them. So what you can do here is you can go through. The other thing for you all would be I need to get more than a single family exported out, which would be open it up, save as. I need all of these exported out of my project into a file. And then at some point I need to upgrade them. You can use that, or you can just upgrade them directly within a project with Family and Project Upgrader. And then you need to load them back in with Family Loader. So these two, Exporter, which I have open, Family Loader, are free tools. So you export these out, you need to load them into a project. Twofold. This one, I'm specifically just trying to export these out to see their file sizes, to see if there's any issues with their file size. From maybe the free model health check that we did, we saw some issues with our file size overall, and we want to see if it's the families causing that issue. We can go through and export all of our families out and then look from the File Explorer standpoint on the file size of those families. If you know there's a specific area that you need to address of families, you don't need to export all of them out. But all you need to go through and do is you can search by category or geometry or none. And then from down here, you can browse to where those are going to be saved out to. You can set a suffix or a prefix to the naming convention. These were in 2022. You can create a category by, so subfolders, by category or category in geometry. And it's going to export all 167. For this instance, I'm not going to select all. Maybe I'll just select view titles and view references here. It'll tell you how many are going to be exported, and you could just export out. And it said there, depending on the file size or the amount of families, it's going to take a little bit. So that's why I didn't do all of them. I haven't done this on this specific lengthy of a process, just because I typically will go through, get my data, then come into here and export those specific ones out, and then address them from there and see what's the issue with those ones specifically. So that's the family exporter tool that you can go through and use. Next one would be managing right out the gate. Typically, a starting template will have, if you're a consultant, even if you're not a consultant to the architectural firm, the architectural firms too could have placeholders. So if you do have placeholder links, which help your end users start your process more efficiently, you can use the import and manager link here to go through and manage those links at the beginning. You always want to have, not always, you should, it's better to have, best practice to have placeholder links, because then you can have views that already are associated to those links. And in those links, which I have a ton, because I imported all that CAD content. You want to have placeholder links because you can set up views with view templates that already have specific links not showing in specific views. So when we're going through and looking at this, you can go through and address those if you have created them or things that have been imported in your project from here. And what I'm saying about placeholder links is typically in a template, what you want to go through and do is create views that are specific to coordination and then specific to your discipline. So in here, I would have gone through and created coordination views that show the respective discipline coordination links shown. And then in the other views that are my working views, I don't want to see the links because I need to go through and model my content, right? So that's when you'll go through and create those links already in your template so end users don't have to modify those views. And that just streamlines the process, right? What we're trying to do here is create an efficient starting point for end users. So when they get into the project, they can start modeling. They don't have to create views that are specific to seeing specific things because that takes time. And then the next thing would be adding content, right? You don't want end users to go through and go and look at old projects with content that isn't what we want them to add. We want content in our project that end users are almost always going to use. I will tell you, I've added a ton of content into a project before, and it doesn't add unnecessary bloat from just the out-of-the-box Revit families. Now, I ride that with caution because you need to be aware of if you're adding families that you've created, were they from like Revit City, which is not the best place to go and look for content because the end users creating that content like to fill it with unnecessary metadata. Now, that being said, if you're adding that type of content in to start out the gate, you're already having an issue because you're already having bloated families in your project. You want to make sure everything's lean and clean when you're bringing it into your starting template, but you want everything in your starting template that your end user is going to need on a typical project. Now, if there's those cases where you have a content management solution, which is the best case, we do offer a content management solution here. It's called Hive, that allows you to store all of your content outside of your template. So you don't have to have that. Well, I would say about 75% of the time they're going to use it. Well, if that's the case, then stored in a content management solution, they don't have to go and look at old projects or through File Explorer. They can just search using Hive. Hive is an excellent tool for many things because it also stores system families, which a lot of other content doesn't, right? Because when you're bringing in content from old projects like system families, you have to transfer all of them over. When you transfer all of them over, it's everything. You can't pick and choose. But from here, I can go through and pick and choose and search for content that I want to add. You can even take it a step further and add things like my standard structural notes. If I want to go through and add an entire sheet with all of my standard structural notes for, let's say, foundation design of concrete, right? Or maybe CMU design, or steel or wood, and we have typical standard notes. I don't have to worry about going and creating that notes or having that in my template with unnecessary content because it's different build types. I can just say, hey, for this specific project, I need this sheet with all of these typical standard notes in here and just load that into my project. So I just clicked load. We're going to bring it into here, and it's going to bring in all of those drafting views specific to the project as well. And sorry, wrong project. You do, if you have multiple projects open, if you remember, I opened up another edition of Revit, so it didn't automatically load this in. But I did notes on drafting views here. Hive does not host legends. So if you had your notes and legends, it wouldn't work. But from here, that's the one thing you can't load in Hive. Just like you can't just transfer project standards or legends, you have to use, the add-in that Autodesk recommends or some other tools that have it as well. So as I go through and look here, it's adding all those drafting views, all the notes, and already putting it onto a sheet. So I don't have to worry about going through and looking at those and placing them onto the sheet where they need to be. I can have my end user just start driving, right? So in a matter of seconds, I just had my existing title block, and then I can go through and look at all of my content that's specific to it. So again, being aware that content management solution is the best optimal, but I love to give everyone options. If you do it internally, where you're not having content management solution, then you should load everything that's almost to be used on a project. I would say 95%. I would even say 80% to be used on a project, loaded in. You just got to be wary. Look at that file size between 10 megs to 15 megs. You don't want to exceed that just starting a template. Anything larger than that, then you're going to have an issue. And if you do want a model health check, a complementary model health check on your template file, we'd be more than happy to do that for you as well. And then we do one that's paid for that does give you that spreadsheet at the end that I was talking about to really mine that information. The other complementary one is more of a graphical representation of issues that could be that are troublesome in your project that you can reference to. But that will complete our cleaning out of our template, going through and looking at our standards that we have in place, going through and seeing some of our content. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, we didn't have more than an hour. If we did, I'd go even more in depth and show you even more things. If you're looking for a template review to be done on your template and suggestions of around a 15 to 20 page report, and then have a more engaging 1 hour review of that, and then come up with a strategic plan on how you can go through and tackle those things in your template, we do offer that as well. But thank you all for listening to me today on this webinar on your efficient process of going through from a chaos order, non-order, chaos, then to order, of streamlining your Revit templates and standardizing them, right? What are some of those processes you can go through and do? Thank you. Thank you for listening today. If you do have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. If you're watching this on YouTube, comment, like, subscribe, all the good stuff. You know what that is right down below. But for now, thank you all. If you do have any more questions, feel free to ask them now. We still have some time. So you have 10 minutes to ask me questions. If not, I appreciate it. I know your time is valuable. Thanks for listening to me today on this webinar.
Hey there, thanks for tuning in. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe and check out some of the other content on our channel.